In 3 minutes, before the nurse came to remove the wires. From my chest, I heard my son laughing behind the hospital curtain. He said I would not live long enough to change the will. And his wife whispered that he needed to move fast before I got clear-headed again. Then she asked if the bank would accept the power of attorney papers before the weekend. I kept my eyes closed. I let the heart monitor beep beside me. I let them think the old man in the hospital bed was too weak to understand. But in that moment, with the smell of disinfectant in the air and my wedding ring loose on my finger, I finally understood the truth. My own son was not praying for me to recover. He was waiting for me to die. My name is Raymond Carter. I am 76 years old, and most people in Cedar Falls, Iowa, used to know me as the man who could fix anything that made noise, leaked water, or refused to turn on when a family needed it most. For 39 years, I owned Carter Mechanical Services, a small heating and cooling company that started in my garage with one used van, 2 toolboxes, and a wife who believed in me before anyone else did. My wife's name was Louise. She had red hair when I met her, soft brown eyes when she grew older, and a way of touching my shoulder that could quiet every worry I carried home. She handled the books when the company was young, and she answered phones while stirring soup. She washed my uniforms, raised our son, stretched our dollars, and never once made me feel small for coming home tired. Our son, Mark, was the only child we had. Louise nearly died bringing him into the world, and maybe that made us love him with a fear we never admitted out loud. I missed sleep so he could have braces. I worked weekends so he could play travel baseball. I took emergency calls on Christmas Eve so he could attend a private college in Chicago and tell people his father owned a company, instead of telling them his father crawled under broken furnaces for a living. And when Mark wanted to start a real estate investment firm after graduation, I gave him the money I had saved for a fishing cabin by Lake Red Rock when his first deal collapsed. I paid the tax bill. When his second deal went badly, Louise begged me to stop rescuing him, but even she could not stand to see him fail. We told ourselves he was ambitious, not selfish. We told ourselves he was under pressure, not careless. Parents can build a whole religion out of excuses when the child they love keeps disappointing them. The money I had was not lottery money, and it was not lucky money. It came from cracked knuckles, winter roofs, midnight calls, missed dinners, and a wife who wore the same church coat for 12 years because she wanted Mark to have every chance we never had. And the house was paid off, the retirement accounts were strong. The company had been sold to 2 younger men who still mailed me dividend checks. Each quarter, Louise and I had planned to travel after retirement. But cancer got to her before we ever made it past the brochures. After she died, the quiet became a living thing. I kept her robe on the back of the bathroom door for 6 months. I cooked soup in the same pot she used and ate it standing over the sink because the kitchen table felt too large. Mark visited often at first. He brought coffee, talked about medication schedules, and told me I should not be alone. I wanted to believe grief had brought him closer. I wanted to believe losing his mother had finally softened him. Now I understand that some people do not come closer because they love you, and some come closer because they hear the lock turning on a safe. The first strange sign was not dramatic. It was not a slammed door or an angry demand. It was Mark asking where Louise had kept the blue binder, and that binder held everything important. Insurance policies, property records, passwords written in Louise's careful handwriting, copies of our trust papers, old stock certificates, and the contact information for our attorney Samuel Price. Louise had organized it years earlier after one of her friends died and left her husband unable to find a single account number. And she used to say that love was not just flowers and anniversaries. Sometimes love was making sure the person left behind did not have to search through drawers while grieving. Mark had never cared about that binder before. But 3 weeks after my first heart scare, he asked about it while pretending to help me clean the den. He stood near the filing cabinet too long. He flipped through old folders with the patience of a man looking for something specific. And when I asked what he needed, he smiled and said he was only trying to make things easier for me. After that, the questions came wrapped in concern. He asked whether I still remembered the online banking password. He asked if I had updated beneficiaries since Louise died. He asked whether the house was inside the trust or outside it. He asked whether I had named him successor trustee. He asked if Samuel Price was still practicing or if I wanted a younger attorney who understood modern estate planning. His wife, Kendra, was smoother than he was, and she arrived with casseroles. I did not ask for and sat at my kitchen island with her phone face down. Watching every move I made, she called me sweet names she had never used before. She touched my arm when she asked whether I felt confused lately. She told me that many older people felt relief after letting their children manage finances. She said it with a soft voice, but her eyes kept drifting toward the desk where I paid bills. Then came the bank alerts, small ones at first, a failed login from a device I did not recognize, a password reset request I had not made. A call from the credit union, asking whether I had authorized Mark to inquire about a certificate of deposit. When I mentioned it, Mark laughed it off and said he had only been checking, because he worried scammers might target me. And I noticed other things too. My checkbook had moved from the top drawer to the middle one. Louise's old notary stamp, expired for years, was missing from the cigar box where she kept office odds and ends, and a blank medical release form appeared under a stack of mail. The form already had my name typed on it. Still, I said nothing. I had spent my life diagnosing machines by listening before touching a wrench. A furnace tells you what is wrong if you let it run long enough. A failing bearing whines before it breaks, a bad valve ticks before it floods the basement. My son was making noise. I just had to keep listening. The real insult happened after I came home from the hospital. Mark and Kendra insisted on staying with me for a few days. They said it was temporary. They said a man my age should not be alone after a cardiac episode. They brought overnight bags, then grocery bags, then 2 suitcases. By the 3rd morning, Kendra had moved my coffee mugs to a lower shelf because she said I should not stretch. By the 4th, Mark had taken my truck keys from the bowl near the front door and placed them in his jacket pocket, as though my life had become something he could manage by removing objects. On Sunday afternoon, he invited his business partner, a polished man named Trevor, to my living room. Trevor wore a navy blazer and shoes too shiny for a house where my wife's slippers were still under the bedroom chair, and Kendra set out coffee as if they were hosting. Mark pulled a folder from his briefcase and spread papers across my own coffee table. The documents used phrases like protective planning, and temporary authority, and asset preservation. I recognized the smell of a trap even before I read the first page. The plan was simple. Mark wanted me to sign a durable power of attorney giving him control over my accounts, my dividends, my medical decisions, and the right to transfer trust assets for what the document called family continuity. Kendra kept saying it would reduce stress. Trevor kept nodding like a man who had already been promised a fee. Mark spoke slowly, not because I needed him to, but because he enjoyed sounding patient. I sat in my recliner, the one Louise bought me after my knee surgery, and watched my son explain my life to me. He said the business dividends were too complicated. He said the house required maintenance I could no longer handle. He said my medical scare had proven how quickly things could change. And then, with Trevor looking at the carpet and Kendra pretending to straighten napkins, Mark said the words that split something inside me, cleanly in two. He said, I would not last long enough to make this difficult. And he did not say it with anger. That was what made it worse. He said it with the tired confidence of a man discussing a closing date. He had reduced my life to a calendar window, and my recovery to an inconvenience, and my death to paperwork he wanted finished before the weekend. For a few seconds, I heard only the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I looked at the framed photo on the mantel, the one of Louise and me at Mark's college graduation. In that picture, my son stood between us with his arms around our shoulders, smiling like the future belonged to all of us. And I remembered the loan I signed for his first office. I remembered Louise sewing a button on his suit the night before his first pitch meeting. And I remembered him calling me from a gas station at 2 in the morning because he had blown a tire and did not know what to do. A father's memory can be cruel. It gives you the child and the stranger in the same breath. I did not yell. I did not throw the folder. I did not remind him of every bill I had paid or every chance I had handed him. I simply placed my palm over the signature line and slid the papers back across the table. Mark's face tightened. Kendra's smile disappeared for half a second. Trevor cleared his throat and said nothing. I told them. I was tired, that was all. I let them believe the old man had run out of strength. But the truth was different. I had not run out of strength. I had finally run out of excuses for him. After that afternoon, I became very quiet. Mark mistook my silence for surrender, which was the first mistake men make when they have never had to earn patience. He thought because I moved slowly. I thought slowly. He thought because I did not argue. I had accepted defeat. And he thought because I loved him. There was no line he could cross that would make me protect myself. I let him believe all of it for the next 2 weeks. I lived like a guest inside my own life and watched everything. I watched Kendra photograph documents when she thought I was napping. I watched Mark carry my mail to the den before bringing it to me. I watched Trevor return twice with revised papers, each version giving Mark more authority and leaving me with less control. I watched them whisper in the hallway near the bedroom where Louise had died, as if the walls of that house had not spent 40 years listening to me breathe. At night, when the house went still, I made my own records. I wrote dates in a spiral notebook Louise, once used for grocery lists. I saved text messages. I printed emails. I called the bank and asked for a complete log of recent access attempts on my accounts. I requested copies of every inquiry made by anyone claiming to represent me. I asked my cardiologist for a written statement about my mental capacity after the hospital stay. He seemed surprised by the request, but he understood after I told him my son was confusing a weak heart with a weak mind. And then I called Samuel Price. Samuel had been our attorney for 28 years. He had handled the sale of my company, the trust Louise and I created, and the final update we made after her diagnosis. His voice was older than I remembered, but sharp. When I told him what Mark had said and what papers he wanted me to sign, Samuel did not sound shocked. That bothered me more than if he had gasped. He asked whether Louise had ever given me a sealed envelope marked for after her death. I knew exactly where it was. She had placed it in the back of the cedar chest under our winter blankets. I had never opened it, because grief has its own locked rooms, and some days I could not bear to touch anything that still smelled faintly of her. That night I opened the chest. The envelope was cream-colored, thick, and sealed with clear tape because Louise never trusted glue. My name was written across the front in her careful script. Inside was a letter and a second set of instructions for Samuel. I read both at the kitchen table, under the same yellow light where she used to balance our checkbook. By the time I finished, the house did not feel empty anymore. It felt like Louise had been waiting there all along, one hand on my shoulder, telling me to stand up. Louise's letter did not accuse Mark directly. That was not her way. She wrote with the gentle precision of a woman who had spent her life noticing what others tried to hide. She said love should never require blindness. She said she had watched Mark become more interested in what we could provide than who we were. She said she feared that when she was gone, he might mistake my loneliness for weakness. Then she explained what she had done. 2 years before her death, after Mark pressured us for money to save another failed property deal, Louise asked Samuel to revise the trust. I remembered signing documents at the time, but I had been so consumed by her treatments that I did not study every page. I trusted her. I trusted Samuel. I trusted that the woman who had protected our family for 48 years knew exactly what she was protecting me from. The revised trust contained a clause I had forgotten existed. If any beneficiary attempted to coerce me, financially exploit me, challenge my competence in bad faith, forge documents, or pressure me into transferring assets, that beneficiary's inheritance could be suspended immediately by the trustee and redirected into a protected fund. The fund would provide for my care first, then support Louise's favorite causes after my death, a hospice center, a trade school scholarship, and a small grant for widowers who could not afford home repairs. There was more. Louise had insisted that Mark never receive direct control of company dividends. His share, if he remained eligible, would pass through a managed trust with strict conditions. No lump sum, no control over my accounts, no right to sell my house, no authority over medical decisions. She had known him better than I wanted to admit. Samuel sent me copies of everything the next morning. He also told me something that made my hands go cold. 2 days after my hospital admission, his office had received an email from someone claiming to be me. The email requested an emergency change making Mark sole successor trustee. The message contained old personal details, but the wording was wrong. I had never called my son my sole remaining priority. I had never used the phrase streamlined family transition. Samuel had ignored the email and preserved it. The bank records arrived that same afternoon. There had been 6 login attempts from Mark's office address. A request had been made to add him as an authorized contact. Someone had tried to schedule a meeting with a bank officer using my full legal name, my birth date, and the last 4 digits of my social security number. The appointment was canceled only because the bank manager, a woman named Denise Alvarez, remembered me from the company sale and thought the request sounded strange. Then came the final piece. My doctor faxed a letter confirming that I was alert, oriented, capable of making financial and medical decisions, and not under any cognitive restriction. Attached to it was a note from the hospital social worker. Mark had asked her whether a patient with cardiac weakness could be considered temporarily incompetent if family members were concerned about confusion. The social worker documented the question because something about his tone unsettled her. I laid every page across my dining room table. The forged email, the bank logs, the medical note, the trust clause, Louise's letter. Each piece alone was troubling. Together they formed a picture so clear it hurt to look at. My son had not simply hoped to inherit. He had begun the process of taking while I was still alive. Once Mark sensed I was delaying him, he stopped pretending to be gentle. He did not explode all at once. People like Mark rarely do. They tighten the room inch by inch until you realize you have been living inside a cage they built while calling it concern. He began by taking over small things. He canceled the lawn service because he said it was too expensive, then hired one of his own workers and charged the payment to my card. He replaced my landline voicemail greeting with his own voice so callers would leave messages for him first. He moved my medication bottles into a plastic organizer and kept the prescription list in his briefcase. Kendra became sharper. She corrected me in front of visitors when I forgot a name. even if the name belonged to someone she had never met. She told my neighbor, Mrs. Donnelly, that I had been having episodes. She used that word because it sounded medical without proving anything. When Mrs. Donnelly brought over banana bread and asked if I needed help, Kendra stood behind her with a smile that warned me to be careful. Mark tried the bank again. This time he arrived in person with Trevor and the unsigned power of attorney papers. Denise Alvarez called me from her office while they were sitting across from her. She spoke carefully and professionally, but I could hear the anger beneath her manners. She asked whether I had authorized Mark to discuss account transfers. I told her no. She asked whether I wanted the bank to place an internal security flag on my accounts. I told her yes. She asked whether I wanted a note requiring in-person verification with photo identification and a verbal password known only to me. I told her yes again that afternoon. And Mark came home furious, though he tried to hide it. He said the bank was making things difficult. He said I had embarrassed him. He said people would start thinking the family was divided. I looked at him and realized reputation mattered to him more than my safety. Then he touched Louise's things. I came into the bedroom one evening and found Kendra sorting through my wife's jewelry box. The lid was open. Louise's pearl earrings were placed on a tissue. Her wedding necklace, the one she wore in our 50th anniversary photo, was wrapped in Kendra's hand. She said she was only organizing. But there are some lies so ugly that even the person telling them cannot make them sound clean. Mark stood in the doorway and said those things were doing nobody any good, locked away. He said Kendra could use the necklace at an upcoming charity dinner. He said Louise would have wanted family to enjoy it. I did not answer because if I had spoken then, grief would have come out like fire. The next morning my truck was gone from the driveway. Mark claimed he had taken it for inspection. When I called the garage, they had no appointment under my name. Later, I found out he had asked a dealer what it might be worth as a trade-in. The truck was 17 years old and dented near the rear bumper, but Louise had ridden beside me in it every summer when we drove to the farmer's market. To Mark, it was an asset, and to me, it still held the shape of her hand on the passenger door. Then came the assisted living brochure. Kendra left it beside my breakfast plate like a menu. The place was expensive and polished, and far enough away that no neighbor could drop by without planning ahead. Mark said it would be safer for me. He said the house was too much. He said he and Kendra could manage the property until permanent decisions were made. And he used that phrase often, permanent decisions, as if my life were a business file waiting for final approval. I let him talk. I let him think he was advancing. In reality, every step he took made Samuel's case stronger. And the bank security flag had a date. The social worker's note had a date. The attempted account access had a date. Mrs. Donnelly wrote a statement after Kendra told her I was declining. And the jewelry incident was captured on the small hallway camera I had installed years earlier after a package theft. Mark had forgotten it existed. Kendra had never known the more they pushed, and the less they looked like worried family. They looked like people racing a clock only they could hear. By the end of the second week, Mark scheduled what he called a family meeting. And he invited Trevor, Kendra, my nephew Paul, and a young attorney I had never met. He told me it was time to stop dragging this out. He said everyone needed clarity for the first time in weeks. And I smiled after he left the room. Clarity was exactly what I planned to give them. The family meeting was held in my dining room on a rainy Thursday evening. That room had seen every kind of family weather. Birthday cakes, Christmas dinners, Louise crying quietly after Mark left for college, me sitting alone after her funeral with a paper plate of food I could not taste. It seemed right that the truth should come there too. The table was oak, scarred at one end from the year Mark carved his initials into it with a pocket knife. Louise had been angry for 10 minutes, then kept the mark because she said someday it would make us smile. It did not make me smile that night. Mark arrived first, carrying his leather folder and wearing the expression of a man already bored by victory. Kendra came behind him in a cream coat, her hair pinned neatly, Louise pearl earrings in her ears. Seeing them there almost broke my calm. But I had learned something over the years. A man does not win by letting pain choose the timing. And Trevor came next. Then the young attorney who introduced himself as a planning consultant. He avoided saying who he represented, which told me enough. My nephew Paul arrived last. And Paul was Louise's sister's boy, a good man who had always stayed out of family money matters. Mark had invited him because he wanted a witness who would pressure me to be reasonable. I had asked Paul to come early, but Mark did not know that. Paul had already sat with Samuel that afternoon and reviewed enough documents to understand why his face looked pale. I let Mark begin. He spoke for nearly 20 minutes. He explained my recent health event. He explained my supposed confusion. He explained that responsible families made hard choices before crisis forced their hand. He explained that my assets needed protection from taxes, scammers, medical costs, and in his words, emotional decision-making. He never once said what I wanted. He never once asked whether I was afraid. And he never once looked at the chair where his mother used to sit. When he finished, he slid the power of attorney papers toward me again. This time, I picked them up for a second. His face softened with relief. Kendra exhaled. Trevor uncapped a pen. The planning consultant straightened his tie. They all thought the old man had finally folded. I tore the papers in half. I did it slowly, once down the middle, then across. The sound was not loud, but everyone heard it. I placed the pieces on the table in a neat pile and looked at Samuel, who stepped in from the kitchen doorway with his briefcase in one hand and Denise Alvarez beside him. Mark's mouth opened, then closed. Samuel did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He placed the trust documents on the table first. He explained that Louise and I had revised our estate plan years earlier. He explained the coercion clause. He explained that any beneficiary attempting to pressure, exploit, forge, or manipulate me could be suspended from inheritance by the trustee. He explained that I had invoked that clause that morning. Kendra's face changed first. It was small, but I saw it. Her eyes moved from Samuel to Mark, then to the pearl earrings in her own reflection on the dark window. Denise placed the bank records beside the trust. She described the unauthorized login attempts, the appointment request, and the attempt to add Mark as an authorized contact. She confirmed that my accounts were now locked under enhanced verification and that no transfer, beneficiary change, or account access request would be honored without my direct in-person approval. Mark leaned back as if distance could make facts less real. Then Samuel placed the forged email on the table, the one pretending to be from me, the one requesting an emergency trustee change. The planning consultant suddenly became very interested in the torn power of attorney pages. Trevor stared at Mark with the look of a man calculating how much of his own name was now attached to the mess. I watched my son search for anger, then confusion, then wounded innocence. He had worn each mask so often that none of them fit anymore. Samuel kept going. He read the doctor's letter confirming my capacity. He read the hospital social worker's note about Mark, asking whether cardiac weakness could support temporary incompetence. He placed Mrs. Donnelly's written statement beside it. Then he opened his tablet and played the hallway video from the night Kendra handled Louise's jewelry box while Mark discussed using the necklace. Kendra reached for the earrings then, as if touching them reminded her. They were evidence. I finally spoke. My voice was quieter than I expected, but it held. I told them that I had spent my life fixing broken systems. And the first rule was always the same. Shut off the power before the damage spreads. That was what I had done. I had shut off the power. Samuel then explained the legal effect. Mark's inheritance was frozen pending review. His role as successor trustee was revoked. He had no authority over my accounts, my medical decisions, my house, my dividends, or Louise's belongings. Any further attempt to access my finances would be reported. The forged email and bank records would be preserved. If Mark challenged the trust, the no-contest provision could eliminate the remainder of what he might still receive. The room went silent in the way rooms go silent after a storm has ripped the roof away and everyone can see the sky. Mark looked at me then, truly looked at me, perhaps for the first time since his mother died. I did not see remorse, not yet. I saw panic dressed up as betrayal. He seemed offended that I had protected myself from the very thing he had been doing. That was the saddest part. Even with the proof spread across the table, he still believed he was the injured one. Consequences do not always arrive with sirens. Sometimes they arrive through certified mail, frozen accounts, canceled appointments, and people suddenly refusing to return phone calls. That was how Mark's world began to shrink. The first loss was control. Samuel filed the trust amendment and formal notice of suspension. Mark was removed as successor trustee and replaced by a private fiduciary Samuel had recommended years earlier. My medical directive was updated the same day, naming my nephew Paul and my doctor as contacts instead of Mark, and the bank removed every note connecting Mark to my accounts. Denise personally oversaw the security hold, and for the first time in weeks, I slept without imagining someone moving money while I dreamed. And the second loss was reputation. Trevor withdrew from Mark's pending real estate deal after Samuel informed him that documents presented in my home might become part of a legal inquiry. And the planning consultant sent a letter claiming he had misunderstood the family situation. Mark's investors heard enough to become nervous. Men who had once laughed with him over lunch began asking for written confirmations. A lender paused approval on one of his projects. People who live by confidence can bleed badly from doubt. Kendra returned Louise's pearl earrings in a padded envelope without a note. The necklace came back 2 days later by courier. She did not come herself. I was glad. I did not want another performance in my doorway. Then came the legal pressure. Samuel did not push me toward revenge, but he did insist on protection. The forged email was sent to the proper authorities. The bank kept its own records. The hospital social worker documented everything again in a formal statement. And no one kicked down Mark's door. No one dragged him away during dinner. Real consequences in America often move through paper before they move through people, and paper can be merciless when every date lines up. Mark called me 11 times the first weekend after the meeting. I did not answer. Then he sent messages about misunderstandings, stress, grief, bad advice, and his fear of losing the family legacy. And he never wrote that he was sorry for waiting on my death. He never wrote that he was sorry for treating his mother's jewelry like inventory. He never wrote that he was sorry for trying to turn my heartbeat into a deadline. Finally, he came to the house. I watched him through the front window. He looked smaller on the porch than he had at the dining table for one brief, terrible second. I saw the boy who used to stand there with a muddy baseball glove, asking if I had time to play catch before dinner. Then he lifted his hand to knock, and I saw the man who had asked a hospital worker how to have me declared incompetent. I opened the door but kept the storm chain fastened. He said he needed to talk. He said Kendra was upset. He said his business could collapse if the trust issue became public. He said I was overreacting. He said his mother would hate seeing us divided. And that was when I stepped back from the door, not because I was afraid, but because he had used Luis' name as a tool one time too many. I told him through the narrow gap that his mother had seen more clearly than either of us. And then I closed the door. The hardest part of justice is that it does not erase love. I did not stop loving my son that day. A father does not turn off 46 years with one legal document. But love is not permission. Love is not access. Love is not a blank check handed to someone because they share your blood. In the weeks that followed, Mark lost the pending project, and Trevor cut ties. The lender demanded additional guarantees Mark could not provide. Kendra moved into her sister's condo for a while, though I heard later she returned after making him sell one of their rental properties. And Samuel informed them that any remaining inheritance, if Mark ever became eligible again, would be limited, delayed, and managed by a third party. No cash advances, no control, and no shortcuts. That hurt him more than any speech I could have given. He had waited for me to die because he thought my death would make him rich. Instead, his greed made him powerless while I was still alive. And spring came late that year. For months after the confrontation, the house felt like a museum of everything I had survived. The dining room table still held the faint marks from the folders Samuel had spread across it, and the hallway camera still blinked above the trim. Louise' jewelry box sat on my dresser, closed and polished, as if it had never been touched by hands that did not understand what it meant. And I moved through each room slowly, not because of my heart, but because memory has weight. At first I thought peace would feel like victory. I thought I would wake one morning relieved that Mark had lost control, relieved that the accounts were safe, relieved that the trust had done what Louise meant it to do, and I did feel those things. But peace was quieter than I expected. It did not cheer. It did not clap. It sat beside me at breakfast and asked what kind of man I wanted to be. Now that I no longer had to defend myself every minute, I started with small repairs. The back porch steps had sagged for years, and I replaced the boards with Paul over 2 Saturdays. Paul was not handy, but he listened, and that mattered more. Mrs. Donnelly helped me plant marigolds along the front walk because Louise had always said yellow flowers made a house look forgiven. I took my truck to the farmer's market again. The first time I reached for the passenger door out of habit, grief hit me so hard I had to stand still in the parking lot. Then I bought peaches because Louise would have judged me if I came home empty-handed. Samuel helped me finalize the protected fund in Louise's name. We called it the Louise Carter Home Dignity Fund. It paid for small repairs for elderly widows and widowers who owned homes but could not afford to keep them safe. A furnace here, a wheelchair ramp there, a leaking roof before winter. The first recipient was a retired school bus driver whose water heater had failed in January. When the contractor sent me a photo of her standing beside the new unit with both hands covering her mouth, I sat at my kitchen table and cried for the first time without feeling ashamed. That was when I understood what Louise had really done. She had not only protected money from Mark, she had protected my heart from becoming hard. She had made sure that what we built with love would keep moving outward, even after one person tried to drag it into greed. Mark did not disappear, and people like him rarely do. He sent birthday cards with careful handwriting. He left voicemails on holidays. Sometimes his words came close to apology, circling the truth without landing on it. And he said he wished things had gone differently. He said grief had changed him. He said Kendra had pushed too hard. He said business pressure had made him desperate. Every message had a reason, an explanation, a soft place for blame to hide. I saved the messages but did not answer most of them. On Father's Day he came by again. This time he brought no folder, no consultant, no plan. He stood on the porch holding a paper bag from the bakery where Louise used to buy cinnamon rolls. He looked older, not old like me, but older in the way men look when life stops agreeing with their version of events. I opened the door without the chain but stayed in the doorway. He said he had been wrong, not confused, not pressured, not misunderstood. Wrong. That word did not fix everything. But it was the first honest tool he had ever brought to the job. I let him sit on the porch with me. We ate cinnamon rolls from paper napkins and watched cars move slowly down the street. He cried once quietly and wiped his face before looking at me. I did not hug him right away. I did not invite him inside. I did not restore his inheritance. Forgiveness is not the same as handing someone the keys again. But I told him. I hoped he became the kind of man his mother believed he could be. That was all I could give him then. It was more than he deserved and less than a father wishes he could give. By summer, I made one more change. I sold the big house, not because Mark had pushed me out, not because I was afraid to live there. I sold it because Louise and I had once dreamed of a smaller place near water, and I was tired of treating our dreams like old coupons that had expired. I bought a modest cottage beside a quiet lake in Minnesota, close enough for Paul and Mrs. Donnelly to visit, and far enough that my mornings belonged to birds instead of traffic. I brought Louise's robe, her recipe box, the wedding photo, and the jewelry box. I left behind the dining room table because some rooms deserve to keep their ghosts. On my first night in the cottage, I sat on the back deck with a blanket over my knees and listened to the water. Touched the dock, the sky turned orange, then purple, then the soft blue Louise used to love. And I twisted my wedding ring around my finger and thought about the hospital curtain, the heart monitor, and my son's voice saying, I would not last long, he was wrong. I lasted long enough to see the truth. And I lasted long enough to protect what my wife and I built. I lasted long enough to learn that a father can love his child and still lock the door against him. And for the first time in a long time, when I went inside and turned off the lamp, the silence did not feel like emptiness. It felt like peace.